Welcome to the Actually You Can podcast. I'm Miff Galloway, a performance coach passionate about supporting ambitious and high-performing women just like you who know they have untapped potential just waiting to be unleashed. If you're looking to massively up-level your performance in all areas of life, you've come to the right place. My goal on this podcast is to take you beneath the surface so you can connect with yourself on a deeper level while providing you with valuable insights and the tools necessary to navigate life's challenges and go after your goals with strength, clarity, and wisdom. If you're ready to uncover the truth which lies underneath so you can recognize your powerful feminine leadership style, pursue your goals unapologetically, and thrive in every aspect of your life, hit the follow button and get ready to explore the incredible possibilities that lie within you. Together, we'll uncover your next steps in achieving peak performance, because actually, you can. Welcome to another episode of Actually You Can. Today, I'm super excited to have on Coach Celeste Stacey, who is a sought-after mindset coach, organizational trainer, keynote speaker, and certified diversity executive. She helps high-stress professionals break free from chronic overwhelm so they can love their life again. Celeste, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
And so we're going to be talking about all things overwhelm. So to kick it off, I would love to hear, what is overwhelm? What are we talking about when we say we feel overwhelmed?
That is a great question, Miff. So overwhelm is a pervasive feeling that happens over time where there is this low level din of mental restlessness that you cannot tune out enough to feel relaxed or free no matter what you do. And overwhelm has various stages. And I think people get confused about what it is and what it isn't. And we can go into the various things that it isn't. So, overwhelm is not anxiety, although anxiety is contained in overwhelm. There are various levels of it. So, stress is the first level. Everybody experiences stress, and stress is just a body response to something happening that is outside of our control. Now, the next level up is anxiety. Anxiety is an over preoccupation with worrying, with all of the what ifs. So, for example, if if we're stuck in traffic, and a stress response might be, oh my goodness, I'm going to be late for my appointment. Look at all of this. We may go through anger. We may go through frustration. We may even go through fear that we're not going to make it to where we need to be. Anxiety is a level up, and it sounds like this in that same situation. It sounds like, oh my goodness, what if I can't make my appointment? Say, for example, it's to a doctor's office. What if I can't make my appointment? If I can't make my appointment, what if there's something really wrong with me? What if I'm really sick? And if I'm really sick and I can't reschedule, what'll happen then? And oh, by the way, I just left work. What if everything keeps piling up? And what if I'm like, so that's anxiety. The next level up from that is acute overwhelm. So, acute overwhelm and chronic overwhelm are two different things. Acute overwhelm is when something seems so chaotic in the moment, you feel inundated. And once you get through that thing, everything settles again. So, in that same situation with that car ride, acute overwhelm may sound like, oh, I have all this email. I'm pretty sure I have all this email piling up that I'm going to have to respond to. I'm going to be late for my meeting. And that means I have to stay late and I can't pick up my kid. And I'm going to have to find somebody to pick up my kid for me. That's acute overwhelm. Now, chronic overwhelm is all of those things, all of those emotions built up over time for so long that we normalize it. We call it life. And those extreme responses that we have, we internalize and we absorb to the point where we live that stress. We are in a heightened state of stress every single day, only it becomes this low level hum that we can't get rid of. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. And what I'm hearing in that is, especially chronic overwhelm, it's not like you wake up one day and you're chronically overwhelmed. It's this accumulation of emotions over time. And from that point, how do we allow ourselves to become chronically overwhelmed? I'm sure there's a number of listeners who are sitting there going, oh, yep, that is me. I can empathize with all of that. How do we allow ourselves to get to that point?
We allow ourselves to get to that point because we normalize it, we justify it, we rationalize it, and we call it life, right? So when we are in situations where, say, for example, it's a work situation, and we are being given more work than we can possibly do with deadlines and all of these things, instead of most people pushing back, having necessary conversations, they try to keep up. And if they can't keep up, they make themselves wrong. So all of the ways that we build up chronic overwhelm hinges on the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And not if you tell yourself a story about yourself enough times in relation to your environment, if you keep saying, well, there are two conversations, there are two different questions that we constantly try to ask ourselves and things that we constantly try to prove. One question is, am I good enough? So people who ask that question are constantly trying to prove that they belong where they belong. Okay, that's where imposter syndrome comes in, all of that stuff. The other side of it is the question, am I really that good? So people asking that question are constantly trying to prove that they're all that. They have raised a bar for themselves, this invisible bar that they created, and they are constantly trying to live up to that in their minds, right? So that is how we build that up over time. And I want to make a distinction between chronic overwhelm and burnout because I hear the confusion between the two constantly. They are not the same thing, okay? Chronic overwhelm is what I just mentioned. Burnout is the result of it. So chronic overwhelm is a process, burnout is the result. Picture chronic overwhelm as the unchecked high blood pressure, the unchecked high cholesterol that leads to the heart attack or the stroke that is burnout. You do not want to get to burnout. You do not want to get to a heart attack or stroke. So when you hear people say, "Oh my goodness, I am so burned out," that's like saying somebody saying, "Oh my goodness, I am so in cardiac arrest." Right? They're not the same. They're not the same. So, yeah, that's how we allow ourselves to get there. We don't even notice it anymore. We call it life.
If you're looking to do the inner work this winter, then you need to join the Actually You Can Intensive. This is my brand new 7-week small group program, and the goal of this program is to serve as a powerful journey of self discovery that will help you to get clear on what you want, break down those limiting beliefs, and reprogram any of those unwanted behavior patterns so you can become the person you know yourself to be and achieve your wildest dreams. Enrollment is now open, and I'd love for you to join me and other ambitious women on this transformative journey. Together, we'll unlock your full potential and set you on the path to living a powerfully aligned, fulfilled life. We kick off on the 8th of July, and I'll pop a link with more details in the show notes. And feel free to reach out to me on Instagram at Miff Galloway if you have any questions. Now let's get back to the show. And when you said that, just a big part of me just sort of laughed out loud because you're totally right. We have normalized it. I'm fortunate enough to be surrounded with really high achievers and people with really big and lofty goals. And yeah, the narrative a lot of the time is, oh, I'm just super busy, or life is really full, or I'm just under a lot of stress. And it just seems to be the saying that is usually thrown around in that circle. And when you mentioned that it comes out essentially to two stories that we're telling ourselves, am I good enough or am I really that good? I just felt tired thinking about that. If I'm going through life thinking about those two statements all of the time, no wonder I'm feeling overwhelmed. And I'm interested to hear from your work with your clients. How do you start to identify potentially which story they're telling themselves? And I'm assuming you do some work around reprogramming that story or rewriting that story. What does that look like for your work with your clients?
Absolutely. And before I go into that, I want to just kind of validate something that you said where everybody's like, "Oh, I'm so busy, I'm so busy." It's almost a badge of honor, right? For high
Yeah.
achievers to say that. High achievers navigate life in a way that inadvertently introduces overwhelm into their lives because They
Mm.
consistently ask those two questions subliminally. They take on problems that are not theirs to solve. They over identify with whatever organization, work, whatever, even their own companies that is going on,
Mm.
right? So you're, if you're an entrepreneur, for example, your company is an entity. It is not you. You are the face of it, but it is not you. So over identifying with something where you take on things, and anything that happens to the company you take on as a personal attack or a personal thing, you're not going to be able to separate yourself from anything that happens. Your company, your organization's function is to provide a service, generate profit, and function the way it functions. You are the leader of that organization. So yes,
Mm.
that is. It's interesting that you giggled, but it is a badge of honor to say you're busy, you're busy, you're busy.
Mm.
Now, what that looks like in unprogramming, exactly, you use the correct word. It's reprogramming. It's an unlearning of everything that
Mm.
supports that mindset. What we do is we look to see foundationally what's beneath that. So one of the things that we do, and it's just the beginning of what we look at, is arguably in our formative years, which I say up to the age of 18, things happen to us in our lives that either made us feel guilt or shame. Most people in chronic
Mm.
overwhelm are driven by one of those two emotions, guilt or shame.
Mm.
And based on that, they build stories around how they need to navigate the world. Of course, as we grow older, those that guilt, that shame that we felt, even if it was not intentionally inflicted on us, the way we felt about it as we grow older, of course, we navigate, we are adults, we move through the world, but we're still making decisions from that place and we don't realize it. It's uncovering those decisions and uncovering that thought pattern that enables us to begin to unprogram, to help people unlearn that. And it's a bunch of other things, but foundationally, that's where it starts.
Yeah, and even hearing you talk to that, just the embedded feeling of guilt or shame, and what's coming to mind is high achievers, we say like being busy is a badge of honor. I still think fundamentally being a high achiever is a good trait to have of someone. And I probably made it sound like it's really bad. Like, you're already chronically stressed and overwhelmed. And so I'm interested to hear from you. How can we potentially still embody the qualities of high achievers? Because I think that's necessary to get a lot of things done in life. And some people really thrive in being in those sorts of environments and putting themselves under that sort of pressure. How could someone thrive as a high achiever, but balance that with the sense of feeling overwhelmed?
That is a great question. So, being a high achiever, I mean, I'm a high achiever. High achievers move the needle in the world. They make change. They are the movers and
Mm.
shakers. They are the leaders. So, when you are a high achiever, you have to understand what that means to you. What is a high achiever?
Mm.
So, a high achiever is someone who aspires to go as far as they can in what they love to do, what they're good at. Nothing wrong with that. The distinction between being a high achiever and succumbing to overwhelm is understanding that you have to separate your identity, your ego, from that thing that you're going after. And how do you even do that, right? How do you even separate yourself from
Mm.
that? You have to be able to recognize the problems that are not yours to solve. You have to be able to
Mm.
recognize it's not just about creating boundaries. You have to be able to recognize how you navigate in that environment and the questions you ask yourself. So when you are in an environment where you want to move ahead and you're saying, oh my goodness, I want to get that particular raise, I want to go after that particular thing. And you look at the requirements and what's required to do that, you have to ask yourself questions about how can I bring my best work without feeling as though I am compromising my life. Because
Mm.
that reason is so important, because every single high achiever without exception, I speak to a lot that I've spoken to, they are killing it in their careers, in their businesses, and everything else. But outside of that, they don't really have much of a personal life. They don't really have
Mm.
much going on. And so, if you're willing to make that sacrifice, if you're willing to put all your eggs in one basket, great. And at the same time, when you look around and there's nothing else to lean on, and something goes wrong in that one basket, it starts to fray, you're going to feel the
Mm.
effects more than anyone else who has a more rounded situation. So, again, the first thing is to ask yourself, how can I move forward without compromising the things that are important to me in other areas?
And it's really interesting to hear you mention that because I see a lot of clients who are really committed to their work, and you would potentially say that work is their life. And they often find it's hard to identify what's important to them outside of work. They go, I just really love my job. I work long hours. It pays the bills for my family. How would you encourage? It's almost like these people don't want to look at their life outside of work. And if I'm to mind read, I feel like it's because they don't want to be honest with themselves and go, actually, potentially my life outside of work isn't awesome. I mean, you hear if there's challenges with relationships, maybe someone throws themselves into work because that's their way of coping with it and not having to deal with what's happening outside of work. What experience do you have, I guess, on that line of thinking with high achievers throwing themselves into work and the consequences outside of work and getting them to acknowledge that there is a life outside of work and it can actually be a really good element of your existence?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. First of all, the way most high achievers, and I can vouch for that, I am a recovering perfectionist. Most high achievers are perfectionists, right? They set up rules that are very, very difficult to win. It's either 100% or it's nothing. The reason why people who throw themselves into their work and do it 100%, they're killing it. But when they look outside of work, there's really nothing much going on. The reason they don't want to look outside of that is because it doesn't fit into their frame of perfection. When they look outside of
Mm.
work and they see pretty much that they're coming home, they're zoning out, they're scrolling social media, they don't really have much of a personal life to speak of, much of a social life, none of that stuff, they're neglecting their care. That is a fail for them. So the way we get people to look at it is we go through a process that has them evaluate holistically their life
Mm.
and what's important to them outside of that, right? So outside of that work thing, that one passion that they have. And 9 times out of 10, they're very, very happy doing that one thing.
Mm.
So we have them evaluate, okay, if this one thing were to go away, what's left? How would you, for example, create the same level of passion, grind, high achievement in this one area that
Mm.
you've neglected, that you've been doing in this number one thing that you love, that you've set aside everything else for? um, there are things that we pretend not to know to protect ourselves from feeling fully the effects of that neglect, and we help people uncover those areas of neglect, feel through them, and get their lives back.
I love that approach of looking at life holistically. I do a similar process with my clients at the start of all of my one on one containers. It's through an exercise called the Wheel of Life. And it's amazing just how, I guess, not familiar people are with actually looking at their life from a 360 point of view. Normally, we consider maybe three main areas, whether it's relationships, work, and your health, but actually acknowledging that our life doesn't operate in silos and actually making improvements in one area can have some really great benefits in other areas as well. I think too often we can turn the burner up to full gas on one area of life and then realize that we've got no gas left for the other areas and just what the consequences are. It's almost like sometimes I feel like I need to give little bits of evidence that it's okay to maybe turn the throttle down a little bit on one area of life and ignite it in other areas of life, and just enable them to experience just how more fulfilling and rich life can feel if you have other areas of life that can also bring you that same, not the exact same sense, but a level of fulfillment in that space. What would you say to that?
I 100% agree. I love the Wheel of Life because it gives an immediate visual to people who go through it. The Wheel of Life that I've used over the years, I've used the Wheel of Life. That's a foundational coaching tool, And that's something I've used for 14 years. The one I like to use has 8 spokes, 8 areas, and
Mm.
it immediately shows people the imbalances in their lives. And it says, okay, if this would, you've drawn a new perimeter, if this was a real wheel, how easy would it be to roll? And people get the idea, right? And that's why I absolutely love doing that with brand new people, so that they can kind of get an idea of their imbalances. Once you know your imbalances, it's about really learning how to flesh that out again in a way in which is going to stick, in a way in which all of those shoulds, all of those what ifs, all of the things that we succumb to when we really don't understand how to navigate properly come up. And that's
Mm.
where the battle is. It's not in identifying the imbalance, it's in knowing how to get balanced again in a way that's going to be sustaining. So yeah, I 100% agree with that.
And what I'm hearing with overwhelm as well is it's an emotion. And from my understanding with emotions, they're based on feelings and thoughts. And we talked about reprogramming thoughts. On that train of thought, are we essentially choosing to feel overwhelmed, or what influence do we have in feeling overwhelmed?
So overwhelm, depending on the situation, everything's a choice, and some things. So,
Mm.
for example, anxiety. Um, Scientific research has proven that anxiety can be in our DNA, right? So we're not talking about that. So even
Oh,
though
wow.
anxiety is part of overwhelm,
Yeah.
that's something separate. Now, overwhelm, yes, is a choice. Overwhelm is a learned response over time to something. And
Mm.
the unlearning is so difficult for most people because they do not understand how to tease out their emotions on the surface and how things really look from what's really going on in the subtext of their lives. So yeah, it
Mm.
is it is a learned response. So much so that it does not even seem like a choice for some, right? They call it life. This is my
Yeah.
life. This is what I have to do. It's a belief that they have, not so much of a choice. If they could choose, they would rather choose something different. But they don't feel they. Most people don't feel they have a choice.
Yeah. And 100%. And on a similar thought, I hear a lot of people going, I just like being busy. I like being kept busy. And it's that statement that results often in that and a feeling of overwhelm over time. Do you think we can be addicted to being busy and therefore being addicted to feeling overwhelmed?
I think that it's important for us to make a distinction between being busy and being overwhelmed. So,
Yeah.
overwhelm over time is a feeling in which it's a pervasive feeling where you find it
Yeah.
so hard to focus on one thing without feeling like it's at the expense of another. You feel
Mm.
exhausted. You feel all of the mental all the responsibilities of everything that you have going on, all of the competing responsibilities, juggling so much in your head that you cannot quiet it. When you leave that environment, you cannot fully enjoy where you are because you are constantly thinking that you're leaving something behind. That's what we're talking about.
Mm.
It's more than being busy,
Yeah.
right? So, being
Yeah.
busy, you can be tremendously busy and not overwhelmed at all, and you can
Yeah.
be
Okay.
tremendously overwhelmed and not busy, right? On the surface,
Yeah.
you could be sitting there staring at a wall, staring at the television, but what's going on inside your mind is what dictates that overwhelm. Your mind could be chaotic, you can be imploding. And you could also be sitting there at a table at dinner with a smile on your face with your friends. So, yeah, busy and overwhelmed are different.
Yeah, and thank you for making that distinction because I just naturally assumed feeling overwhelmed with doing action, but you're completely right. I personally can empathize with sitting in front of the TV, being like, I have no idea what I'm watching because I'm going through my to do list right now. I feel so uncomfortable sitting here right now with all these things that are still outstanding in my mind. Is that sort of what you're referring to?
That's exactly what I'm referring to. So you can't quiet your mind. Even when you're resting, you're not completely at rest, right? Because the thought of
Yeah.
all of those things will not let you rest mentally. So that
Yeah.
is what I'm talking about when we say chronic overwhelm,
Yeah.
chronic overwhelm. It very, very quietly hijacks your life.
Yeah. And I had a question from a listener come through. I mentioned that I had yourself coming on this morning, and a question they asked is, how can you balance doing your full-time role, so having a really busy work week and then feeling like you have a lot of responsibilities on the weekend? It sounds like this listener was really feeling the impacts of overwhelm. Not sure if they're at the stage of chronic overwhelm just yet, but when your to-do list is that long and you always feel like you have stuff on and you can't quiet in your mind, what would you say to that person there?
Yes, that's a great question. Now, we're always going to have something to do. Some of our to do lists are longer than others. When you find yourself seeming like you have this never ending to do list, it's time to start asking yourself some important questions. And one of those questions is, out of all of these things that need to be done, number one, are any of these not my problem to solve? And that sounds kind of cold, especially if they're not your problem to solve. If you're doing a favor for someone, if you're taking over from someone, you know, that's a question you can ask. Now, if you have children and you're taking children to sports and you're coordinating schedules and you have all this stuff to do at home and at work, and then you leave
Mm.
and you're just like, I'm exhausted. The question then remains, in your exhaustion, what are you willing to release? And people say, well, I can't
Mm.
release anything. I can't release my kids. I can't release my job. But you can release some of the things that you are taking on that you're telling yourself you need to do. And only you know that, right? A never ending to do list simply means that, number one, you haven't established important boundaries that say that you're one person and you can't do it all, even to yourself.
Mm.
And number two, you're telling yourself stories about yourself that say, I really should do this. I really need to do this. And if I don't do this, then what kind of person am I? So it's about challenging those stories that you tell yourself. Now, I don't know what your to do list looks like, but I do know that a never ending to do list is an indication of one of those things.
Yeah, and even hearing you ask the question, what can you release? I know there's listeners out there being like, I can't release anything. If I stop spinning all these plates, my whole world's going to come down. What would you say to someone whose gut reaction is that?
Someone who feels that if they release something, their whole world is going to crash down is someone who has normalized a life of chronic overwhelm to the point where they literally call it life and they literally believe that if they stop functioning in that way, they're going to implode. What I would say to that person is to get some help navigating that situation. So, because it's really, really hard for us to see the picture of ourselves when we're sitting in the frame. It's really, really hard to see the
Yes.
different perspective, right? So I would say to that person, get another perspective, speak to somebody who specializes in chronic overwhelm, and let them help you work through this so that you can get your life back and break free.
Yeah. And hearing you say that, it's also giving them hope that life doesn't have to be that way just because you've normalized it. And we normalize a lot of things, right? Like we normalize scrolling on social media, we normalize convenience and junk food and being lazy. It doesn't mean that it has to be your normal, right?
Exactly. Now, social media didn't exist about what, 12 years ago or something like that.
Yeah.
It did. Most of social media didn't exist yet. Today, people have normalized waking up, checking in, doing things that we didn't even think about doing before, right?
Yeah.
And so your point, that does not have to be your normal, and it could be adding to time crunch. It could be adding to your overwhelm. It could be adding to a lot of things that you prevent you from taking time out and feeling free in other areas.
And so you've provided some really incredible insights and powerful questions to ask ourselves if we find ourselves moving along the spectrum. We might not be at chronic overwhelm right now, but we might be feeling anxiety or bouts of acute overwhelm. What's a really actionable step someone can do in the next 24 to 48 hours to ensure they're pulling themselves up before they end up in chronic overwhelm?
I would say the most important thing you can do is to ask yourself, what am I trying to prove here? Ask yourself, am I trying to prove that I'm good enough? Or am I trying to prove that I'm just that good? And if you're trying to prove that you're just that good, I invite you to lean on some of your vulnerability that you have. When I say vulnerability, high achievers, so many high achievers are so afraid to show people that they're human that they forget that vulnerability and saying, you know what, I don't know all the answers, but let's work on this together. I have some suggestions. And bringing people on board to help you help them and, in essence, balance your life out is a sign of strength. It's a sign of leadership. If you're trying to prove, am I really that good? Oh my goodness, I have to really keep up. Then that's another question. And it requires digging a lot deeper and saying to yourself, is that true? What evidence do I have that I'm not, what they say I'm in, what I think I am? If I'm in that position, why am I in that position? Because I am good enough. But number two, it's really important before any of that to recognize the signs of chronic overwhelm. Okay. So, like I said, chronic overwhelm feels like a persistent, low level hum of mental restlessness that you cannot tune out enough to feel completely relaxed or free. Even when you're smiling, even when you're resting, you're not completely at rest because you feel the weight of all the things competing in your brain, all the responsibilities you're juggling, the guilt, the obligation of all those shoulds. You're going to notice if you have chronic overwhelm that you have difficulty feeling completely relaxed. You're going to notice that you find it hard to focus on one thing without feeling like it's at the expense of another. You're going to notice that you feel like you're mentally juggling so much that just the thought of it all is exhausting. If you are a perfectionist, you are at high risk for chronic overwhelm. So if you tend to get upset and ruminate when you don't meet your very own high expectations, if you fall into imposter syndrome, if you tend to procrastinate, you are at high risk. If you are a high achiever, like everybody listening here, you are at high risk. So a high achiever is the type of person that takes on a lot of responsibility. You tend to have difficulty saying no because, if not you, then who, right? If you find yourself filling deficiency gaps, inefficiency gaps around you, if you find yourself over identifying with your company and saying we, you are at high risk for chronic overwhelm. So that is the first step. Recognize the signs. And once you recognize the signs, ask yourself those two questions. What am I trying to prove? And dig beneath the surface. The last thing you can do if you say, you know what, Celeste, this sounds great, but it still sounds a little bit confusing. I don't know if I can do that, is reach out and get help.
As you're going through the list of signs and symptoms, I'm sure the audience is going, me, I do that. And what I'm hearing in those two questions you're encouraging the listeners to ask is, I think it's really common for us to take the thoughts that we have in our mind as fact. We don't allow ourselves to challenge them. And just because we think something doesn't mean it's fact. I'm sure as human beings, we can all remember thinking something that we later went on to disprove. So for the listeners who are like, oh, yes, I am trying to prove that I'm good enough, or I am just that good, challenge your beliefs and have the courage to, because you can challenge your beliefs in any area. We just often don't turn that reflection inwards and have that introspective perspective.
Absolutely. Yes.
And so thank you so much, Celeste, for
Thank you
sharing
so much
all
for
of those
tuning into
insights
today's
today, in the sake
episode.
of not
I
wanting
hope
to
this was
feel like we're
helpful.
immediately
If you
contributing
thought
to
of
the sense
someone while
of
listening to
chronic
this
overwhelm
podcast,
for
I
the
would be
listeners.
so
We'll
grateful
call
if
it
you
there
could
for
share this
today.
episode with
But
them.
if someone has
While you're doing that,
identified
please
that
also take a
working
moment to
with
leave a
someone
review
in
on
this
the
area is
podcast
the
if you
best next
haven't
step for
yet
them,
already.
where can they
It
find
takes
you?
less than a minute and it
Sure.
means
Thank
so
you.
much to me and
And
helps
first of
this
all, it's been a
podcast to reach more
pleasure
people
sharing. It's
just
been
like you.
wonderful.
Thank you so
They
much
can
for that,
find
and I'll
me
see you in the
at
next episode. In the meantime, go out and
celestestacey.com
achieve every dream
forward
you have,
slash
because
hum.
actually,
H is in
you
happy,
can.
U as in umbrella, M as in move. And there you will see more information about it. And if you can relate, we can have a one-on-one conversation so I can learn more about your situation.
Amazing. And I'll put that link in the show notes as well. Thank you so much, Celeste, for your time today. Very much appreciated.
Thank you so much, Miff. I appreciate it.